here's what I want to do. Here's my agenda, my to-do list, if you like. First of all, I want to just give you an overview as to what we're seeing in the world of blue box. With specific attention to Canada, I'm going to show you which provinces are who's doing what, essentially. And then once I get through that, to give you that overview, I want to then take you into the world of MMBC, Multi-Material British Columbia. Once we clear through that, and there are some complexities which I will do my best to explain to you, I'll then focus on what we would recommend you should be thinking about, what you should do. And then I'll simply conclude by just a one-page overview as to where Magazines Canada is spending its time as we advocate for better clarity and change and a number of things really on this file across the country. And then there'll be time for questions. So I will try to be as economical as I can as I move through this presentation so that we've got time for questions, because I know you all have some. So if that makes sense, let's get started with what's going on and why. I think you have to start by saying that politically, landfill and incineration is becoming a very hot topic most anywhere you live in Canada. It's becoming incredibly expensive. It's a political landmine because nobody wants either landfill or incineration in their backyards, and everybody's very vocal about that. The second point worth noting here is the recognition of the opportunity to transform waste into worth. Essentially, legislators have woken up to the fact that all the residual materials that are getting buried in landfills actually do have end-of-life value, whether it's plastic, paper, metals, glass. There is an end market, a commodity exchange where one can actually make some money. The third thing that's really driving this whole idea of blue box, aside from trying to minimize the cost of landfill and the politics that come with that, the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment of all the provinces, as well as federally, have gotten together for, I think, annually now for the past few years to try and discuss this problem and how it can be dealt with. And one of the answers was to institute these kinds of programs that we're seeing rolling across the country, of which MMBC is just one. And at the heart of this, which nobody likes to hear, particularly publishers, really any producer, is that government essentially is downloading the cost of the blue box system onto producers. They are passing the cost along at various percentages. I'll explain that in just a couple of minutes. To whoever manufactures that product. The trouble is, of course, is that governments are not decreasing your taxes, your municipal taxes, your provincial taxes, despite the fact that they're having across the country hundreds of millions of dollars in really windfall revenues that producers are now beginning to pay. So all 10 provinces now are either developing or running an extended producer responsibility program, EPR for short. And that just simply means that producers now have responsibility for their products through to end of life. So map of Canada, you can see programs in each. Those 3 programs in red are now active programs. The others are in development or essentially preparing to launch. So you can see that Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec are the 3 that currently have programs in place where producers are paying their way at various levels of commitment. The next one up will be Multi-Material British Columbia in 2014, May of 2014. Following that, we anticipate that Saskatchewan will next come in. A plan has been written, but it has yet to be approved by the Minister of the Environment. We expect that that program will be up and running probably by 2015. Alberta has just popped out of the cake with consultation just 6-8 weeks ago, and they've begun some consultation to figure out what is it that they should be thinking about as they go forward. And I can assure you that they're watching the MMBC experience very closely, given your neighbors, but also because it's a landmark, or I guess I should say it's landmark in that it is a very unique program that they're creating anywhere in the world, and I'll explain that to you as we get there. And then on the other side of the country, Atlantic Canada, Recycle New Brunswick is initiating or has initiated an RFP for somebody a consultant to write a plan for how the Atlantic provinces together as one entity should get into this recycling business. So we expect that they, as well as Alberta, are probably at least 2015, perhaps 2016 before they are up and running. Now, individually, this may not matter to you who are just doing business in BC, but for those national businesses, they have to deal with each individual province individually, and it's very frustrating. It's complicated, it's time-consuming, and as a result, I believe that producers have done a very smart thing here. They've created something called the Canadian Stewardship Services Alliance, CSSA. This entity is owned by producers, and their mandate is to try and harmonize as much of these blue box programs as they possibly can across all the different provincial jurisdictions, starting with consistent reporting, invoicing, making sure that research that's done in any one particular province is usable in other provinces rather than spending the same research money time and time again to get the same kinds of answers, and the same audit processes so that there is some consistency and comparability. The second thing that they will provide is a GR service working with provincial governments to, as much as possible, get the regulatory frameworks harmonized. Now that's tough because every province obviously likes to own their own legislation, but there may be things that they can do to make sure that the complexities are at least reduced, if not eliminated. The third thing they want to do, and this is quite important for a lot, and you can appreciate this, I'm sure, as business people, it's to seek cost predictability and stability across producers. We're finding in some of the provincial jurisdictions that are running now that you have very little lead time with which to budget for the costs that that you're liable for. And so CSSA is trying to find a way to ensure that there is some predictability and budgetability going forward so that you can predict what kind of impacts these will be having on your P&L. A common definition of an obligated producer, that's incredibly important because right now every province is somewhat different, and that too can be quite frustrating. And last, a national harmonized list of the packaging and printed papers that can actually go into the blue box stream. Ontario may well be the worst at this. Every municipality has jurisdiction over what can and can't go into their blue box. So that means that there are products that you can put a certain plastic in a blue box in one community, but in the next community 10 kilometers away, you can't. So from an education standpoint, it's very difficult for people to really understand what I should be putting in the blue box and what I can't. And of course, if you're a producer, and I'll pick on the plastic producers for a second, because they're probably most at risk here, is that some plastics are just simply not acceptable in some places, and yet they have to report and register all of their volume, but some of it is simply going to landfill because municipalities just will not handle it. So that means that they get penalized for that kind of inconsistency across the country. So it's confusing, it's complicated, it's frustrating. You should know that Magazines Canada does sit on this new CSSA advisory committee. For my many sins, I am now the designated victim. So my job is to help try and get the magazine industry issues across to CSSA so that we can be working on them. And there's already a list of things that they're doing on our behalf to make our lives a little bit easier. So let's talk about some core principles behind the blue box programs, and this applies specifically to MMBC. It's the producer that is directly in the crosshairs. We are in their sights, and their government's point of view, the Ministry of Environment's point of view, is if you make it as a producer, then you are responsible for that product right through to end of life. And I think that's a concept that was borrowed from Europe, where these kinds of programs have been in place in Germany and some other countries for some time. And the rationale here is that only producers have the ability to reduce the amount or the type of materials that they're using for packaging or printed paper. So only they can actually make changes to make sure that things are recyclable or are lightweighted, or whatever it takes to reduce the impact of waste on the environment. And so they've created, they call it a penalty, or sorry, they call it an incentive. We call it a penalty for producers to do, the right thing. And so that's where we pay the bill. And there are lots of problems associated with that, which I will take you through in just a moment. But essentially, if we just stay with magazines here for 1 second, once a magazine goes into the blue box, it stops becoming a cultural product and it becomes consumer waste. And so it becomes the responsibility of the Ministry of Environment to deal with it in the most efficient and with the least impact on the environment as possible. And so producers are on the hook for that. So any packaging or printed paper that ends up in the residential blue box stream is subject to participation. And here's the list. Printed papers, magazines, newspapers, catalogs, directories, and all just other sundry household papers, right down to retail receipts. Plastics, metals, glass, styrofoam, and there's even legislation around hazardous and special waste, such as tires and oils, electronics, and batteries. So all of these products are very much in the sights of the MOE and are legislated into this program. Now, each producer is obligated to pay its fair share of costs based on a few different things. And I think the key word here for everybody has to be fair share. And we at Magazines Canada have been watching this very closely because we feel that we are not paying our fair share. We're paying more than our fair share. But to get into the mechanics first, first of all, there are different rates and different costs for each type of material. Some are easy to recycle. Magazines is one of those. Some are more difficult, and those would be some of the more lightweight plastics. And so those costs differ. And so what each of the blue box jurisdictions attempt to do is to measure the cost using cost accounting and audits to figure out what are the costs that can be attributed to recycling, the handling, it's the collection, the handling, and the ultimate selling off into the end market of each individual product. And all the accountants get together and figure out what that means in terms of a fee per material. And so what's also recognized in all of this is the fact that there is value of each material at end market. So, and certainly for paper fibers, that's the case. Aluminum is really the poster child because it's such a high value metal. And so there's a ton of value at the end of the day when aluminum cans get recycled. So what all this means to publishers is this. First of all, you are responsible for what you produce and what goes into that blue box stream. And I'm going to talk more about the definition of residential blue box stream in a little bit. But at this point, let's talk about what constitutes a product that you create. Paid magazines, subscription, and whatever is sold through at newsstand. Custom magazines, free magazines, any customer mailings you might produce, whether they're promotional mailings or if they are subscription renewal mailings, they are all part of this program, as are polybags, the film. So all of these things have to be accounted for in terms of tonnage and reported to MMBC, and I will talk more about that as we go. What you can exclude, at least for the time being, are copies that go to business addresses. And that's because, for the most part, business addresses aren't part of the residential blue box system. Traditionally, it's commercial recyclers who pick up the waste from those buildings, and it goes out the back door, and it goes into a separate stream that is not handled by municipalities. I say for the time being because there are some movements afoot to try and roll in institutions, industrial, and commercial facilities, the kinds of waste that's produced there. So I can see a time in the next few years, depending on which jurisdiction you might be in provincially, as to when those kinds of materials, and that could include B2B magazines, might actually be on the hook for this too, but we're lobbying hard for delay, if not elimination, of that kind of thinking. The other thing, and I've touched on this, is that copies shipped to newsstand but not sold should not be reported. So if you only should be reporting tonnage that you have sold through the newsstand. And again, typically what happens is that the unsold copies go out the back door into a commercial recycling stream, not the municipal stream. So this is the fun part. This is where it gets complicated. And I'm going to read this because these are their words, the enacted words, not mine. But I'll try and help you through it. So first of all is, what is a brand owner? And they define a brand owner as an organization or a company that is the registered trademark holder associated with that product. So if that brand or trademark is unregistered, then the producer responsible becomes they're on the hook because they become the intellectual property rights holder of that brand or trademark. So the basic message here is, if you are a brand owner and you are the registered trademark owner, then you are on the hook. If it's not a registered trademark, but it's intellectual property and you are the holder of that, then you're on the hook. To take it further, if a business or organization holds the license for a brand or a trademark, and the key here is now BC business or organization, then that BC business that holds the licensing agreement is the responsible producer, provided that the holder of that trademark is not a resident of BC. So if you are licensing a trademark or a brand and the owner is non-resident, then you are on the hook. But if the owner of that brand, even though you're licensing it, is a BC resident, you are not on the hook. The brand owner is on the hook. I hope that's clear. It's complicated, I know, but that's why I wanted you to see the exact words here so that you could read it for yourself and understand what they're saying. Continuing with the complication, they also have terminology defining a first importer, and this is really specific to those people who are bringing product into BC. And that could be a publisher who is simply shipping through subscription or through newsstand to a distributor or a wholesaler to retail in BC. But a first importer is a BC company that is the first to take ownership or position or control of a product into BC where the brand owner does not have residency. So if I'm a publisher outside of BC and I'm shipping product in for sale or for distribution, it doesn't have to be for sale, then whoever might take first possession of that product is on the hook in MMBC's eyes. And to go on to say that the first importer can only be the producer responsibility for specific packaging and paper in the event that there is no brand owner with residency in BC. So again, if you're resident, you are squarely in the crosshairs. It's where it gets a lot more complicated is if it's a non-resident shipping in, selling somewhere into BC. So in short, if your residency is BC, you're obligated to register and to contribute based on your reported tonnage, and I'll get into that. Sticking with more complicated or as complicated things, if a producer is not a resident of BC, as I mentioned, you can voluntarily register as a voluntary registrant. And I hate that word voluntary because at the end of the day, you're still on the hook if you are a producer, because what happens is this. If you don't voluntarily register, responsibilities for those materials shift to a broker or to a wholesaler or a distributor, even to the retailer if there's nobody in between you and that retailer. So two things can happen. The party to whom responsibility shifts to pay that obligation would go to the wholesaler distributor. So what happens then is they pay on your behalf if they're willing to accept that liability. Or they will simply pay it for you and mark it up. And so you're going to pay more probably at the end of the day if you are a non-resident producer. But more scary still is if the distributor, the wholesaler, doesn't decide to accept that liability, then retailers are squarely on the hook then in MMBC eyes. And what that means is that retailers can refuse acceptance of the product if you're not registered, because they probably don't want to take the liability either. So they have the right to refuse the acceptance of your product. They have the right to delist your product. And of course, they have the right to pay it and mark it up and send that bill back to that non-resident. So just to let you know what the mechanics of this are for others who you might be competing against, because I think that's an important framework for you to understand, so that because the principle in all of this is that everybody should pay their way, and that you as a resident of BC shouldn't pay for their responsibilities. And that's been an issue here in Ontario, which we're very familiar which means that we're paying for people who simply not registered, and that's really patently unfair for those who have, and we're trying to do the right thing. So, switching gears a little bit now. I mean, those definitions have all been focused on MMBC and how they see the world. But just to tell you a little bit more about them and what they're about. MMBC was mandated by BC's Ministry of the Environment to take full responsibility for the Blue Box program in all municipalities. The important word here is full responsibility, because what's very different in BC is the fact that municipalities really don't need to be involved. What's happened is that MMBC has put together a pricing structure for each material based on each kilogram and what they believe it will cost to collect and process, etc., those individual materials. They went to the municipalities to give them first right of refusal. Do you still want to be in the business of collecting these things? And if so, we will then pay you this rate per kilo, no more, no less, and we'll contract for, I think the standard right now is 3 years. And so that's very different, because in every other province, what happens is the municipalities still run the system, they control all of the costs, and they simply send a bill to all the producers saying, this is what you owe us for the collection, for us undertaking these services to collect your materials. And that means that producers have zero responsibility or control over the costs of that whole stream of collection, processing, and selling into the end market, those end products. So it scares the bejeebers out of every producer, because they have no control. They just write big fat checks, and it drives them wild, as you would well imagine. So BC is different in this particular regard, and that's one of the reasons why everybody is watching BC with interest, because it gives producers control over all costs, as well as the payment of those costs to collect the materials. MMBC is a producer-owned entity. It is owned by all of us, everybody on this line, and everybody else who produces a product. And they have a voice within that. And they are meant to be working in the best interest of producers. They have to hit a target rate as mandated by the MOE of 70% material recovery. And the way that works is they simply look at their registered MMBC, totals up all of the registered and reported materials that you've all been reporting and all other producers have been reporting. And their mandate is to collect 70% at least 70% of those materials reported to meet the strict needs of the MOE. So producers pay 100% of the program costs, unlike other provinces, or some other provinces. In Ontario, it's 50%. In Manitoba, it's 80%. In Quebec, it's already 100%. But in BC, you have to pay 100% of those costs. And I'll explain how this all works. But before I do that, I forgot this slide was here. So you know, 1,300 letters of intent were filed by producers before September, whatever the date was. But only 50% have officially registered and supplied tonnage to date. So what's happened is that, and this is what I understand from the folks at MMBC, is that the Minister of Environment has a list of 150 fairly medium to large unregistered BC-based companies that have been identified, who they believe should be part of this program, and they will be going after them to force compliance, essentially. And of course, penalties may apply here, and obligations are retroactive, as we're told. They're looking for first quarterly installments from all registered producers by January 2014, and this program officially commences May 2014. The reason why you prepay is because MMBC operates in what they call real time, and that they have people out there now collecting materials which they then have to buy, and they have to start paying bills by the time that this program actually officially kicks off in May. So it's complicated, but when you get through it all, it seems to make at least some financial sense. Here are the rates for BC. You can see them broken down by material type. And I bolded magazines, directories, catalogs, and other printed papers, which is one big category, at 24 cents per kilogram. That's expensive. It's very expensive. It's the most expensive program in Canada so far. For perspective, in Quebec, it's about 20 cents per kilogram. In Ontario, it's about 13 cents per kilogram. And there are many reasons why, which I'll get into a second, but you can see across all the materials that magazines has got the second lowest rate, fee rate, of all the materials listed. Newspapers having the lowest, and the next one up from us is glass packaging. And it's because these materials are really quite easy to recover, to recycle, and to deal with at the end of their life. Whereas others, like some of the plastics you can see here at 70 cents a kilo, laminates are ridiculously hard to deal with in these streams. And so they're getting levied the higher prices. So as I mentioned, the Blue Box program in BC is quite expensive. The reason why, there are many of them, starting with that MMBC, part of the deal with the MOE is that the MMBC would be mandated to provide Blue Box program in areas of the province where currently they don't have collection programs in place. I'm told that that's about 100,000 residents that are being added into the Blue Box program, which adds to the expense. Secondly, there's geography. There's mountains, there's islands, and these lead to inefficiencies. And the best way I can explain that is to say, if you compare a curbside pickup in Vancouver, you've got people densely populated where a truck can simply drive up and down streets. They can probably fill a truck in, I don't know, I'll make this up, 1 hour. And they then make their transition to a dump facility for processing, which is probably not far from Vancouver, just because that's where the population is. And then they're back on the street, quite quickly. And so their efficiency at collecting things is quite high, because that same truck and that same team of people on that truck is the same if you're in Vancouver or if you are in a remote part of British Columbia, where it's a lot more inefficient because you have to drive further to actually fill that truck, and then you probably have to drive a much further distance to find some kind of a facility that will then take that and process it. And so there's a lot of downtime associated with the rural community collection processing in the depots. So that adds to the cost. Carbon tax in BC, which is not present in other provinces. The fact that BC's beverage container deposit system eliminates revenue from aluminum, which, as I mentioned before, is very high value and is a key part of many of the recycling programs because of its worth. And as I mentioned, the fact that BC is a 100% pay model as opposed to Ontario, which is 50%, but is likely to move to 100% soon. So no matter how you look at it, the fee in BC is high. But the good news in this, and I know this is cold comfort, but the good news in this is that MMBC is owned by us. Everybody's in the same boat here. Everybody recognizes that these costs are likely too high and that there will be tremendous pressure to find ways to reduce that cost over time. And so that will certainly be the key focus of MMBC going forward, is how can they find the efficiencies to get costs down to something that is like running a business. Because, you know, municipalities don't have that same business-like focus, if I may say so. A bright spot in this, at least I think for some of you, is that MMBC is introducing, or is proposing to introduce, a small business policy. They propose a de minimis rate for small businesses, subject to CSSA director approval, which we anticipate will happen. Now, there's been much confusion over this. I'm sure you've received, some of you have received dispatches from us outlining the latest news as we get it, explaining what this de minimis program was going to be, but it keeps changing. And every time we send something out, a few weeks later, they change their mind, and as they fine tune. And so the latest information that we have is that this de minimis may well be a 3-tier system. But there's also some rumors that maybe just a 1-tier system. At the low end, fees would be limited to a membership fee for anybody with revenue, annual revenue in BC of under $750,000. So that might eliminate a number of producers out there. And that membership fee would be $150 annually. So that's the one grade of de minimis, if you like, that we think may live. What's unclear is if the other 2 tiers will gain approval. And essentially, they're looking at 2 flat fees depending on tonnage. Between 1 and 2.5 tons, that would be a $550 annual fee. If it's between 2.5 and 5 tons, that would be a $1,200 annual fee. But you do have the ability to file the way bigger producers might, because if you're at the lower end of any one of these scales, you could probably pay less than that $550 or the $1,200, because it's really more of a mid to high point within that range. So there is a mechanism there where perhaps if you had the stomach for reporting all of your tonnage and for all the work that comes with that, you may actually be able to pay a lower amount depending on where you are on that range. Again, this is all TBD. We await approval, and once we know what that is, we'll certainly communicate that to you. But the overriding principle here is that everybody must pay into the system, regardless of how big or small they are, to eliminate free riders. And this is back to that whole core concept of fairness to everybody, that nobody should have to pick up the cost of recycling somebody else's product. So, some MMBC issues and opportunities. As I mentioned, this is a new program. It's like anything that we're seeing around the world. It's seeing as ground zero because it is so different and so bold, frankly. I know the United States is watching with much interest because they want to get into this business. Europe is watching, and certainly all the other provinces in Canada are watching. The difficulty, because they're mandated to be live with this come May 20th in 2014, is that they are making a lot of stuff up just on the fly as they go. And I don't mean that in a harsh way. I think they're actually doing quite a brilliant job given the time that they have available. And they've surprised a lot of people as to how far they've come. So it doesn't change the fact there's still a lot of confusion around this program. I guess, back to this whole idea of a bold step for municipally controlled programs. We know that there is some pushback, maybe lots of pushback from some of the municipalities in BC, and none of that is particularly clear yet. But the direction it's moving in, again, where we have control over the costs, I think, is heartening, frankly, that we're not subject to bureaucracies on this, at least as much as we are in other provinces right now. U.S. publisher compliance has been a huge issue in every province so far, and they've been unable to date to fully solve the problem. And what I mean here is all of the U.S. publications coming in from the United States, being sold either through subscriptions or through retail, many of them aren't paying their way, and that's just unfair. And those costs, I know in other provinces, have thus far been picked up by the publishers in those provinces. So we're paying their cost, and their tonnage in the system is really quite huge. We estimate, and this is purely an estimate, and it's very hard to get a hard number, but we estimate that U.S. magazine volume is somewhere around 70% of tonnage in the BC stream. So if that's the case, if they're not registering and paying, that means that Canadian BC-based producers could well be on the hook paying for them. And so we've been lobbying incredibly hard in every province to make sure that this gets solved. And we are seeing some headway, but there's more work to be done, clearly. And so we're watching BC very carefully to see who's registering and who's not, and to make sure that compliance efforts are being pushed back to those producers in the States or their Canadian-based wholesalers or distributors, and also hoping that retailers will do the right thing by pushing back as well if the producers, or sorry, if the wholesalers or distributors aren't stepping up. So there's still a lot to watch on this program as it unfolds. Other issues and opportunities. I mentioned that municipalities are pushing back. It's not clear, at least to me at this point in time, because I think it changes almost daily, as to what the status is with various municipalities. Another issue is that there is no printed paper representation on the MMBC or CSSA Board of Directors, and we're working very hard with them to make sure that we have a paper voice on that board. We believe that we have their attention for that need, and it's a question of making sure that it follows through. And this is something that they want to address over the coming months. Let's see, what's next on our list? Yes. All producers do have the option of running their own recycling program, which means you don't have to go through MMBC if you don't want to. The trouble is, it's not an easy thing to do. It's expensive to do, because it essentially means you have to be able to recycle your products in every municipality in BC and achieve at least a 70% recovery rate. That's not easy to do. It's simply a distraction from your job of publishing, and so we've been recommending that that nobody try to go this alone, because the numbers are very much stacked against you. That said, we are working with other groups out there to see if there is a way that we could join forces with other like-minded producers, and maybe there is a way to do this more cost effectively, but certainly any attempts at costing out these kinds of programs for products like ours, the numbers don't work. The efficiencies that are involved within an MMBC are actually quite worthwhile. But that doesn't mean that we haven't stopped looking to see if there is a better way to skin this cat. And if there is, then certainly we would be coming back to industry to try and figure out how do we make this a reality. And lastly, and you'll love this, all provinces, we've seen this in action, it's good and bad, rely on bail audits. In other words, they go into the various processing plants where all of these materials come in to be processed and separated and then baled. They go in and they do bail audits to see who's in there. And I'm talking about specific magazine producers, to find out, what kind of tonnage are they tracking coming out of these bail samples. And they then put you on a list, essentially. They also rely heavily, and I mean heavily, on industry snitches. They put all of the registrants up on a website, on the MMBC website, the basics, so that their competitors can go and take a look and see who's not there, and then say, hey, I'm registered, why isn't my competitor across the street? And so that's a reality of how this program works, and it's part of how all provinces have set up these programs to ensure that there is as much compliance as possible. So, what should producers do? Having heard all of this fun stuff, the bottom line is that if you're distributing products in BC, and if they're likely to end up in the residential blue box or depot system, then it's best you register with MMBC. That would certainly be our recommendation, because the downsides can be heavy. And we don't, so our point, or I guess our point of view is, let's make sure we understand how this program is working or not working, and continue to work to get costs down. But at the end of the day, everybody's on the hook, and that's enacted by the BC Ministry of Environment. If you don't register, it opens yourself up to retroactive payment. If in fact they say that you are in fact a producer who should be registered. We don't know what those penalties are. At least I've not been able to find it in their act. And I'm sure they're going to be looking for poster children. And that 150 companies that I mentioned before that I know is on an MOE list, I expect that that's what that will be about, is finding poster businesses who they can use to set examples. If you don't register, it can result in higher costs if your obligations are paid and marked up by intermediaries. That's if in fact they will accept your liability and pay it on your behalf. So it may cost you more if they pay it for you because they're providing a service to you. And lastly, it may result in retail delists or other product acceptance issues if you don't. That's entirely possible. We know that retailers in BC have gotten together on this very issue to make sure that they're not accepting liability that they shouldn't be. So with that in mind, if you do register and if you do report tonnage, do not report tonnage shipped to a newsstand but that was not sold, and don't report copies that go into an industrial, commercial, or industrial address, because they typically go into a non-residential or non-municipal commercial recycling stream. So if you do register, what happens then? Essentially, once you register, you're asked to report your annual tonnage. Unless you do fall under the de minimis, all you do is simply sign an affidavit that says, my revenue is under $750,000, and you have that verified. Simply pay your $150 and your work is done. It's unclear what would happen if the other two tiers kick in. So once you register and you file your annual tonnage, your tonnage gets grouped with all other like materials, and then various formulas are applied. It's called a three-factor formula. I will not bore you with it or try to explain it because it's next to impossible to explain. It's so complicated. But essentially, these formulas are applied with the objective of rewarding high recovery rates and ease of handling. And the good news here is that magazines fall within that category. We have a high recovery rate, currently sitting at 78% in Ontario. And then the ease of handling is quite easy for both us and newspapers. Your fee is based on your share of the cost to collect, sort, process, and dispose of that tonnage. So again, through cost accounting, they are focusing all of those costs back onto your individual material to make sure that your real costs are being reflected in your fee rate. And the last thing I'll note here is that MMBC fees are paid quarterly beginning January 2014. If you decide you want to register with MMBC, or if you want to find out more to determine, how this program really works, I've given you a number of different click points here to help you figure out where you fit in the whole scheme of things. There is a guidebook here, as you'll notice, the third bullet, to help you understand what your obligations are and how you might fit as a producer. And I would urge you, if you've not registered, to take a look at that just so that you can understand what your potential liabilities might be. My last slide, you'll be glad to know, is Magazines Canada's focus, what we're working on right now. First of all, we're intimately involved in all provinces with the various government agencies, as well as the MOEs and anybody else who will listen, frankly, including CSSA. Our focus is on educating our members regarding the complexities and the risks associated with this, much as like we're doing here today, thanks to the BC Association. Helping to understand current and longer term fee implications here. We know that the fees are higher than they were expected to be. And so we're working with CSSA and others to make sure that there is a very tight focus on how do we get these costs down over time. Third thing that is very important to everybody in each province is to change how magazines are treated within these complex provincial fee setting formulas that I mentioned, and how free writer volume costs, again, U.S. producers as an example, how they're allocated. We discovered after much pressuring of Stewardship Ontario that these three-factor formulas were in some regard working against us. We actually hit a point where we were being asked to pay a fee that was higher than the actual cost of recycling the magazines. And to their credit, Stewardship Ontario was one of the first to notice this, because we were trying to say, why are these costs so high? And so we've been able to negotiate some processes and some research studies to help better understand this. And there's a process in place right now with CSSA to try and get change to these formulas so that we're not paying more than we should be. And there's a lot of sympathy around our current situation. So that's a very key focus for us. And it will also affect you in MMBC because a lot of these formulas are in place in all provinces. We're also trying to figure out the financial impacts of any potential future reduction in recovery rate or in tonnage declines. I mean, people are saying that because of the move to digital that we may have, a slow long-term decline in paper as we increase distribution digitally. So if we're going to be projecting a long-term paper collection, then what does that mean in terms of fees? And what does it mean in terms of recovery rates? And how does that impact fees? So that too is, we have a consultant working on it as we speak, and we hope to see some numbers, if not before Christmas, shortly in the new year. And as we mentioned, trying to get representation on CSSA's board of directors. We need a paper voice because paper magazines are very, very unique within this whole blue box stream. So we need to make sure that our issues are recognized and understood. To the best of our knowledge, the answer is no, that everybody has to pay their way. That could well be something that advocacy could be struck up for over, once this program gets rolling. I'm guessing that MMBC is so ridiculously busy trying to hit their May launch date that they are just focused on the big issues and smaller issues, not to minimize this one at all. But, let's get the program out and then let's figure out how do we now fine tune it. And I expect that might be the case. Effective January 1, our understanding is that CSSA will be up live and running for Ontario, BC, and Manitoba, and that you can go to one website. I think it's actually up now, to be honest with you, and so I think they're torture testing it live. But if you go to the CSSA site, I think what you'll find is you can then get streamed depending on which province you need to enter into. This is not to say that they are fully harmonized yet. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but I think it will continue to increase over time as they have time to actually get into the provinces and negotiate between all the various jurisdictions what they can and cannot harmonize, at least in the short term. And that will be an ongoing focus of theirs going forward. That's a really good question. I don't know the specifics. I've heard the same about Kamloops. I also heard the same thing about Vancouver, but I heard that they were all sort of hovering and that there was a lot of brinksmanship going on as to, to try and force their hand. I'll try to explain what's happening here, and I'm a bit rusty at this because it's a strange concept, but what's happening is this. MMBC is responsible for their registered tonnage. We know that not all producers have signed on. So they have got a big fat number of tonnage, let's say a magazine tonnage, and what they are legally obligated to do is to recover 70% of that tonnage. So what they're doing is they're actually going out to municipalities and buying tonnage. That rate that was offered to municipalities of X cents per ton. And so they're going out to those municipalities who have signed on with them, and they're buying, I believe this is how it works, they're buying tonnage there first. And if they can't meet their requirements to get to that 70% level, they'll then go to other municipalities and buy what they need to meet that number. MMBC's point of view here, and I think it's a very good one, back to the fact that they're on our side because it's us, right? It's all of us, is that they don't want to have to pay 1 cent more than they have to because of things like people have not registered, gotten on board, or because municipalities haven't signed on. So those municipalities who haven't signed on, they continue to do business as they always have. They will continue to collect and process and do what they do. Because they're not part of MMBC, we don't have to deal with their tonnage. All we have to do as MMBC is to buy the tonnage that hits the 70% recovery rate and not a percentage more. So I hope that helps you answer that one. I mean, I think back to it being a very bold program. I really congratulate the folks for doing this. And at the same time, I think the MOE now sees that it's up to them as the compliance entity to go out and make sure that municipalities and producers alike both sign on. So I think it's the MOE who gets to play the heavy here rather than MMBC. At least that's our read thus far. We think that's how it's all going to go forward. But this buying tonnage is a reality. That's how it's working. My understanding there is if you've registered, they being MMBC, will be going through all the registrants and will be making note of you, and that there will be some follow-up. My suggestion is talk to them, notify them that you are under that de minimis level, so to make sure that you're not lost in the shuffle, and so that you can be dealt with appropriately and fairly. And so I would say just make sure that you let them know your status, and then I think you'll get dealt with in the correct way. And I believe in Ontario that producers have been reporting by title. So it could well be in BC, and I'm not exactly sure if this is the case, but I'm thinking that at a minimum, they would be reporting, all the various things that they're producing into the various boxes, material boxes that MMBC has provided. But it's unclear as to whether they would split out your magazine. It seems to me that's a question that you or the college should make sure you understand as to how that works. I mean, at the end of the day, it sounds like they would be on the hook for paying the recycling of that magazine, and that you wouldn't be, because it sounds like you're working on their behalf. They're the owner of the brand or of the trademark. So if that's the case, I think it really comes down, it's their obligation to make. None that I've heard, no. The only, I guess, buy that I've heard about are provinces do not have to, or federal do not have to register for their materials, although we understand that if there are consumer products, and this gets murky, and I hope I'm right on this, that, for example, if there were a magazine that is being produced on behalf of the province, that would have to be reported, but that other materials that they might, mailings, whatever they might be, may not have to be. Thanks, everyone.